Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's great to be back in Chicago, and this paper is very much in the theme of this conference, especially the first paper, trying to look at the role of trade in affecting technical change. And as you can see, it's joint work with two of my former students, Nick Bloom and Mirko Draker. So the question that we're going to address is a pretty classical question in trade, which is what is the impact of southern trade, as in south, as in less lower tech, less low wage countries, on technical change in the north, so countries like the United States and countries in the European Union. So it's an old kind of question, but I think there's rather limited empirical evidence on this, and partly the reason for that is the lack of good microdata, firm level data, where we can get measures of different measures of technical change. So one of the things that we're going to do in this paper is going to be to try and generate some of that type of data, and also partly due to fewer kind of north-south trade natural experiments. So if you think about trade, north-north trade, you've got things like NAFTA and CAFTA and other kinds of things which are kind of discrete changes. Usually with north-south trade, things happen more gradually, more slowly. It's hard to generate such clean natural experiments. So we're going to exploit one of those, particularly China's joining the World Trade Organization, to look at one of those potential natural experiments to develop instrumental variable strategies for trade costs. This paper is mainly an empirical paper, but if you look at the theoretical literature, there's also it's kind of inconclusive over what the impact is going to be. There's ambiguous effects. For example, when we think about the effects of competition on innovation and adaptation, these are generally ambiguous effects, and that's going to be an issue why the theoretical literature is also unclear here. So I'm mainly in this paper going to talk about the kind of empirical evidence from one paper, but I'm going to do also what I tell my graduate students never to do, which is also to present part of another paper which actually puts a more theoretical framework in a kind of endogenous growth general equilibrium model, which tries to take some of the insights of this paper and think about what that might mean in a more kind of a more rigorous type of theoretical framework. So this is a major issue, obviously, both economically and politically. Particularly the rapid growth of China and other low-wage countries has led to a lot of this political discussion over what the impact China has on the economic performance of wealthier countries. So here's an example of that. This is going to be data leading up to the financial crisis. The y-axis here is the proportion of all imports coming from low-wage countries, low-wage following Andy Bernard et al.'s definition. Countries with less than 5% of the GDP per capita of the US between 1972 and 2001. And if you look at the fraction coming into Europe and the US, that's risen very rapidly from less than 4% to almost 15%. And if you look at where that comes from, a lot of that is basically driven by China. So you see that the grey line here of other low-wage countries has basically stayed more or less the same. And it's really China which has driven this very large increase of imports from low-wage countries. Now, the politics is very interesting. So, there have been various attempts to restrict Chinese trade. So here's one from 2010, where President Obama put 30% import duties on Chinese tires, much to the Economist's anger from this front cover. In the 2012 election, it was a major issue here, where there was kind of, a competition over who could be nastier towards China. Despite that, it's still the case that there hasn't been a big retreat from openness and liberalization towards Chinese trade, and we're going to, in this paper, give another argument, in addition to many of the usual trade arguments, why that might be the case, because we're going to argue that China has actually had beneficial effects on technological change in the north. So in case you don't make it to the end of the presentation, I'm going to give you the spoiler in the next two slides, just to summarize. We're going to be using panel data on firms and establishments of about 90 to 100,000 firms from the 1990s and 2000s in 12 European Union countries. And we're going to find that the higher threat of Chinese imports leads to two major results. First of all, and this is, I think, the most interesting result, that looking within firms, the volume of innovation, as measured by things like patenting, citation-weighted patenting, and R&D, increases within firms, as well as other measures of technical change, such as the use of information technology, total factor productivity measures, and some measures of management quality. And that's happening within firms themselves. In addition to that, we're also going to show that there's a reallocation of activity of jobs towards high-tech firms away from low-tech firms. What I mean by high-tech is exactly the measures of patents, IT, and productivity that I said in the previous bullet. So we see both an increase of upgrading technologically within firms, but also between firms. And this is consistent with many of the basic heterogeneous firm models, as you'd expect, that what happens when you integrate with a lower tech, lower wage country like China is that across firms you get this reallocation towards the more technologically intensive firms. So often we think of this at the kind of industry level, in the kind of Ricardian or Heckscher-Ohlin way. We're going to see this happening within industries, across firms within narrowly defined industries. So taking those two kind of results together, the within and between firm results, we're going to find that there's an aggregate technological upgrading in the north from liberalization in a country like China from both of these type of mechanisms. So that's the kind of main results. We're going to show you results which both show this is true in the kind of OLS type of idea, where we think about the way that what's happening is there's liberalization of political change in China, which have enabled them to be integrated with the world economy. But obviously we're alert to the kind of endogeneity problem. So we're going to exploit the fact that after China entered the World Trade Organization in December 2001, there was a relaxation of quotas in the textile and clothing industry, which is very heterogeneous across detailed industry groupings. And that's going to give us a potential kind of instrumental variable, which means that some industries were exogenously exposed to more Chinese import threats than others were, and we can use that to try and look at the causal effect of China. So the overall magnitudes, we have some back-of-the-envelope magnitudes on this, are moderate, but China seems to account for about 15% of the increase of IT patents and productivity in the kind of 2000-2007 period in our data now. That means that a lot of the technological upgrading is other factors, but that's still a non-trivial part which seems to be related to trade in particular with China over this period. Please.
Just a motivational clarification. Is China still a low-wage country according to Andy's?
It's a good question. I mean, certainly it's increased its wages very rapidly over this period.
Do you have to couch this China data with low-wage country kind of a umbrella concept, or is it just China?
Well, I tell you what we do to kind of address. I mean, certainly in the earlier part of the data, China was relatively low wage and still is relatively low wage compared to richer countries, although its wages are going up very rapidly. What we do is we look at, in one part of the paper, not just at Chinese trade, but also trade from other countries. So other countries, inverted commas, low-wage countries, but also richer countries as well. And we actually find that China looks, the impacts we identify of China look similar to other lower-wage countries like India and so on, Mexico and so on. But the impact of innovation from high-wage countries actually is much smaller and in most specifications insignificant. So it does seem to be that imports from China appear to have more of this positive effect on technological upgrading, more so, they say, from imports from richer countries. And we argue that's actually because, if you think about what part of the kind of quality spectrum China is entering, it's relatively low-tech goods. And so it kind of gives incentives for firms to move up the quality ladder by investing in activities to increase higher new goods and higher tech goods. Okay, so the motivation for this actually comes from several kind of interesting case studies, which we call these. You can think of these as econometric case studies because they actually use individual firms, but they also look at this statistically. So there's a nice paper by Richard Friedman and Morris Kleiner, which looked at a US shoe manufacturer, hence the picture, and looked at what happened when the shoe manufacturer faced increased low-wage country competition. And interestingly, there was several things which actually happened there. So in this particular shoe manufacturer, what happened is that they stopped producing some of the cheaper kind of shoes which were under direct competition with China, and actually innovated to create new types of shoes. So they put kind of different types of rings to make it easier for local construction workers to climb up different buildings. They changed the design to make smaller batches, and they actually got patents on some of these new designs. So as in response to the kind of competition in low-wage countries, these firms seem to change what they were doing. And there's a series of papers. There's Bartel et al. On US valve manufacturers, some Italian work by Bugamelli et al. Who have interviewed many Italian manufacturers. And they all found some of these similar type of effects. So increased innovation to develop new product ranges, investment in IT and worker skills, going back to Thomas' points in management practices in response. So these, in some ways, what our study is doing is trying to see whether these smaller scale studies generalize to much closer to kind of population type of databases. So I'm going to, this is the second paper which I'm going to talk a little bit during the presentation, but focusing on the empirical side. So these kind of facts that we think we found on this paper, this kind of positive within firm effect of China on innovation, the fact it's more trade with South rather than richer countries, we try and embed this in a more general kind of general equilibrium model. So we take a kind of almost off-the-shelf endogenous growth GE model, and then we give an extra thing in the model which we call trap factors. And trap factors means a kind of factor of production which is partly firm-specific. So that might be firm-specific human capital, or it might be machines, or it may be, you think of this as managerial time, which is particularly as a firm-specific component. In that type of model, what you can show is that when you have a shock, like the kind of China shock we're talking about, the profits on the old products you're producing obviously fall, and that actually reduces the opportunity cost to shifting some of the trap factors in that firm to innovation activities in new products which China is not currently making. So what this will mean is that you can get, in the short run, eventually all these factors get reallocated across the economy, but in the short run, while these kind of trap factor effects are there, you can get a kind of burst of innovation, particularly within those firms which are more exposed to the China shock. And you can show that in that type of model, it amplifies the standard, so think about the standard type of endogenous kind of growth trade model like Roman, Riviere, Batiste. You're going to get a positive effect on innovation as the market size is larger. So as the market expands, then firms are going to invest more in R&D, which has a kind of fixed cost element, and that will give you a standard positive effect of trade on innovation. This is an additional effect related to the kind of heterogeneous firm literature, which gives you, at least in the short run, a kind of additional positive effect on innovation. And it's kind of consistent with some of this evidence from our study, and also the kind of case studies I mentioned, and I'll elucidate a bit on that as we go through. We actually take this model and do a kind of calibration to it, and I'll show you some of the results from that as we. Okay, so there's a huge literature here, and at a given time, I'm not really going to start getting into it, but there's three broad literatures it relates to. One is around the general literature on trade and productivity. So Ezra's paper this morning was focusing on the kind of learning effects you could describe it as from intermediate inputs. We don't think that's so relevant for China, since this is kind of China has relatively lower tech products than Europe, so we don't think it's the learning mechanism. It's much more related to these kind of competition type of effects that are talked in the IO literature. It also obviously relates to the broader literature, which interestingly finds generally a positive effect of trade on productivity, as Ezra mentioned. But interestingly, a lot of the models developed to understand that, Mellets, Redding and Mellets et al., focuses very much on the kind of between firm effect, the switching of products and switching between outputs of different firms. This is really I'm going to hopefully show this is a strong within firm type of effect, which is consistent with what you find in many of these empirical papers, that if you look at the aggregate increases of productivity in the industry following a trade shock, a lot of that happens within firms, not just between firms. And then, of course, there's other literature on the impact of China. There's very nice recent papers as well on the impact of China and low-wage countries on labour markets. They think of the Orta, Dahl and Hansen paper, which is very related to ours, showing that there's this negative effect on employment for different types of workers following China. We're also going to show that as well in our paper. Okay, so there's 4 sections to it. I'm going to spend a bit of time on the data, so you get an idea about what the kind of data is that we're going to use. Then I'm going to talk about the kind of within plant and within firm effects. then turn to the kind of reallocation effects between firms and plants, and then get on to various kind of extensions and robustness elements to this. Okay, so what is the data that we want to use? So we put together various different data sets. So the first one that we use is data from the European Patent Office. So, patents are one indicator of genuinely new products. I mean, there's lots of issues around them. We have citation information to those patents, so we're going to look at the kind of quality of those patents as well. So we take all the European Patent Office data, and then we match those to the population of public and private firms, both living and dead firms, from this BVD Amadeus data set. So BVD, a private sector company, which puts together the kind of public sector, the accounts of public and private firms all over Europe. So unlike the US, where it's actually quite hard to get kind of public information outside the census on private firms, in European countries you generally have more information on private firms that you can use. So we take all that data, match that in to the EPO data between 1996 and 2005. So we choose 1996, that's when the data generally it becomes pretty good. And the patents data, at least when we did this, ended more or less in 2005. So for 4 countries, France, Italy, Spain, and Sweden, we also have good intermediate input data at the firm level from the Amadeus data set. So we're going to, for those countries, we're going to use these to estimate total factor productivity, separately by industry. We'll use a variety of different methods, including kind of solo residuals, but the main method uses the kind of DeLoca econometrica version of Oli-Pekes, which takes into account when you have multiple products and also trade, and has that actually embodied into the estimation routine. So we allow for monopolistic competition when we estimate the TFP terms there. The third data set is a data set called Hart-Hanks. So this is information which, again, Hart-Hanks is a private sector company. They collect plant-level data on various types of information technology. So we're going to focus as one measure on computers and laptops per worker, and that's easy to measure across time and countries. But we also have other kinds of measures, software-based measures like enterprise resource planning. So this, the Hart-Hanks data is basically they collect it and they sell it to companies like Oracle or Microsoft. So it kind of is market tested in a way. If the numbers are actually incorrect, then Oracle and Microsoft can come back and demand their money back. So it's quite a useful measure, quite a useful survey for measuring information technology, which is very typically hard to get at the micro level. And then for 2 other smaller samples, we have also information from publicly quoted firms on research and development, and also for firms with management data, which comes from the kind of Bloom and Van Reenen approach at trying to measure management practices, which is, let me say, a proxy for the quality of management in firms. So if you're interested, I'm happy to bore you about how we measured management, but take we argue this is a reasonable measure of trying to get some indication of management quality in the firms that we're looking at. Okay, so that's the kind of newish data. The kind of more data, which is probably more familiar to you, is data from UN Comtrade. So here we're just going to take the kind of standard stuff. So this is trade data at the 6-digit product level, matched to 4-digit SIC using the Feenstra et al. Concordance. We're going to use different measures of exposure to China. One is going to be a simple measure, which is just Chinese imports over total imports. We want to normalize it on something. Total imports is a natural thing to do. It's well measured annually at the 4-digit level. But we also use measures of Chinese imports over apparent consumption or Chinese imports over production. The results are very similar no matter which measure we use. There's more missing values on the production data, which is why we tend to normalize on all the imports, but it doesn't make much quantitative difference. So what does the data kind of look like? Well, this is Chinese imports into Europe by 2-digit sectors. This is just an example between 2000 and 2005. So if you actually look at the growth of Chinese imports by different industries, you can see it's very heterogeneous. So in furniture, for example, there's been something like a 10 percentage point increase of imports from China, also very big for apparel and leather and toys. and rather small for chemicals and transport. So most of the analysis we're going to do here is at the 4-digit level, but this just gives you an idea about the fact that there's huge differences across different industries is going to be what helps us identify some of the effects. Okay, so here's the kind of basic equation that we're going to look at. So to begin with, what we'll be doing is regressing the patents or the IT or the R&D, the TOP and management of firm I in industry J in country K at time T on our measure of exposure to China, a set of country by time dummy variables, a set of fixed effects, and an error term. So just to give you some idea of the dimension of the databases, so for the IT data, for example, we have about 23,000 plants and 366 industries in 12 countries. So the variation is going to live at the kind of cell level variation by industry by country. So that's something like 2,800 industry country cells. And for IT, it's going to run 2000 to 2007. And that will differ depending on which of the outcomes that we look at. So we're going to estimate, we'll obviously cluster the standard errors at the industry by country level or sometimes just the industry level. We'll estimate this in kind of 5-year long differences to smooth out some of the transitory shocks and take out the kind of fixed effects.
I think in the question whether it's offshoring or import competition actually matters for sort of this regression because firms' offshoring ability sort of is different, or sort of it doesn't, it's not cost effective for all kind of firms to offshore. So you would think of this, if this is about offshoring, that this alpha should be firm specific, while if it's like import competition, then this is more common across all firms in this industry. So then it's like reasonable to think of the alpha being common. But sort of, I don't know how to think about this regression if sort of an offshoring sort of.
So I guess one question would be why if you interpreted this as all offshoring, you'd have to, so what is the mechanism through which you'd expect this to generate more kind of patenting or more innovative activity? It's perfectly, one interpretation is that, I guess, that even when you face more import competition in your output market, you respond to that with offshoring. But we're also saying that what goes along with that, at least from a correlation point of view, is that you also do more patenting. So remember, this is not, excuse me, this is not patenting per worker. This is just your aggregate volume of patenting activity goes up. So even if you offshore jobs overseas, then this is still saying that you're getting actually more innovative output in your firm as a whole. Okay, so here's the kind of first evidence on the correlation evidence. So the right-hand side here is this kind of growth of Chinese imports. The left-hand side is patenting activity within the firm. So you can see that say a 10 percentage point increase of the Chinese import share is associated with 3% more patenting, which is a kind of significant effect. That's the kind of main kind of interesting, I think, kind of innovation result. If we look at, say, IT intensity, we see the same positive and significant effects. If we look at this kind of TFP measure from the kind of Delokier method, we also find a positive effect. On the smaller samples of R&D type of activities, that also increases quite a lot, and it even is true of looking at these kind of management quality measures. So across a range of number of measures which you think might be associated with kind of broadly increasing emissive activity, Chinese imports seem to be positively associated with that. Because this is in logs, this says like a 10 percentage point increase of the right-hand side variables associated with a 3.2 percentage increase of the left-hand side variable. There's a kind of econometric issue that there's some issues of zeros to deal with, so we just add in the mean and take the logs of the mean. But another way of doing this is a negative binomial type of model. So we also show robustness towards using a kind of fixed effect, dynamic fixed effect negative binomial model. That's in the early part of my career. I have many papers on dynamic count data models, which I will spare you from. But it turns out, rather sadly, that just taking one and adding doing logs gives you very similar results. Okay, so one of the criticisms of this, of course, is that were Chinese imports coming to us not randomly allocated, and we might think, for example, that firms which experience a kind of negative technology shock that affects how much Chinese imports come into that industry. In particular, you might think that there was a negative technology, if there was a positive technology shock to a particular industry, this gave this industry some protection against Chinese imports, so there's less Chinese imports which came in, and this would actually bias the OLS coefficient towards 0. Of course, there could be other stories which could bias the other way, but that's an obvious kind of worry about these estimates. So what we do is we exploit the multi-fiber agreement policy experiment. So multi-fiber agreement from 1974 restricted apparel and textile exports from developing countries. And when China entered the World Trade Organization in 2001, it gained access to the abolition of the MFA. So over the GATT negotiations, the Uruguay round, the MFA was due to be abolished in stages between 2002 and 2005, and even by 2001, some of the quotas had been taken away. So when China entered the WTO, it gained access to this phased abolition, and therefore, across different industries, had this gradual abolition of many of the quotas which Chinese goods faced prior to joining the WTO. There's a very nice paper by Brambilla, Canderwall, and Scott describing this in a lot of detail. So when Chinese textile products came off quota, there was actually this enormous surge of imports into the European Union. In fact, there was this is called the bra wars incident, where you had bras where well, actually a classic example of cheap Chinese products coming in and causing lots of problems for the bra manufacturers of Europe. There were strikes, there were lots of industrial unrest about this. The Mandelson, the trade commissioner, was running around, trying to deal with these things. So it was a very clear, change of exposure to imports. You might think, well, the textile and apparel industry, that's kind of a low-tech industry. In fact, there's about 31,000 patents in this sector over this time period. So there's actually, even in what we often regard as low-tech sectors like shoes or textiles, apparel, there's a lot of innovation which actually goes on. So our instrument is going to be the proportion of your HS6 products covered by a quota in each full-digit SIC in 2000 prior to China joining the WTO. We could use the change between 2000 and 2006, but since the planning was to go down to 0, the kind of level in 2000 is basically equal to the change. So you've gone from a level down to 0. There are some, in 2006, there were some quotas reintroduced temporarily because of things like bra wars. So we wouldn't want to use the actual change of those quotas since they're an endogenous response. So that's why we use the initial level in 2000 as the instrument. And obviously there's lots of issues with this instrument, with pre-trends, and which is obviously things we're going to be looking at when we do robustness tests in case, well, maybe there's something else different in these particular industries which could confound the instrument. I'm going to show you some evidence that doesn't appear to be the case. Okay, so let's look at so this is a subsample of the data. So this is, we have 2,891 observations here, looking at 2005 to 2000. If we go to the OLS, in these sectors, there is a larger correlation with Chinese imports. Kind of unsurprisingly, these are relatively low-tech sectors. We might think the effect is bigger. So there's the OLS effect. The first stage is extremely strong. The bra wars thing works in those sectors where quotas were removed. There was a very big and significant increase of Chinese imports. And then if you look at the IV is actually no smaller. In fact, it's a bit larger than the OLS, consistent with this idea, the positive technology shock shields some industries from China. So that's IT. If you look at look at patents and TFP, you see a kind of very similar type of picture. So the IV lies above the OLS. On the Hausman test, these are not significantly different, but it's consistent with the idea that the OLS is not overestimating the effects. Okay, so the kind of main concern with the IV strategy is actually kind of pre-trends. So you might be worried that maybe in some of these industries they were already becoming more patent intensive or TFP intensive prior to China joining the WTO. So what we do is we look over a longer period, and then we looked at the quota removal post 2001, and what we do is we put in firm-specific trends. So in the difference equation, we put dummy variables in for every single firm. So it's a very tough test of the kind of model. So what you see when you do that is that, in fact, again, if anything, the coefficient increases. So, these are, again, not significantly different, but if anything, this will tell you that these are the industries which are actually on a slower pattern growth prior to 2000 than they were afterwards. And similarly with TFP, the coefficient, even after including firm-specific trends at the end, is significant and positive and slightly larger than the OLS estimate. So that's actually, so I think that's a pretty tough. The other thing that we do is you can just do the kind of regression where you say, let's take, say, the 1995 to 2000 change in different observables, the technology measures, industry size, wages, and see whether that's correlated with the quota instruments, and all those correlations are effectively zero, so that's insignificantly different from zero. So it doesn't look like prior to 2000 there was any evidence of trends. Okay, so so this is one way of controlling with these unobserved technology shocks is through using the quota instruments. The disadvantage of that is only in a subset of the industries. So we look at some other ways of trying to deal with unobserved technology shocks. So one way is just to include 3-digit industry trends. Another way is to think of other kind of instrumental variables. So one instrumental variable we exploit is kind of the trade analog of David Card's ethnic enclaves instrument. So if you remember Dave Card's instrument, it's the idea that where do immigrants go? They go to where immigrants already are. So we use the level of Chinese import share in 1999 in the US and the EU at the 4-digit level as an instrument for subsequent growth. So the industries where China was already strong, like toys and games, those are also the industries where China grew more quickly. So that's an alternative kind of instrumental variable, kind of initial conditions type of instrument. We do things like including lag-dependent variables. All these are kind of supportive of the results you've seen. So all the qualitative results I've just shown you go through with these alternative type of methods.
Just out of curiosity, does the first stage work in the direction we're describing? So
yeah.
Places where industries where Chinese imports were launched grew faster? Right?
Yeah, so toys and games, furniture, apparel, those are the industries where China was relatively strong in the late 1990s, and they were also the sectors where you saw when I showed you the 2-digit thing. So there's lots of. I mean, it could be that Chinese companies already established a bridgehead into those industries. It could also be it just indicates their comparative advantage. So that's what you'd expect. So it's consistent with. I mean, it's less compelling because it's a kind of levels. It's a kind of levels type of thing, and you might worry that it's reflecting some other kind of thing. It can't be mean reversion, of course, because that would be negative. But the first stage is very strong for those type of regressions. Okay, so that's the kind of within firm type of results. What about the evidence on reallocation between firms and plants, the more conventional things? So the way we tackle this is we have a very simple approach. So we take employment growth as a measure of kind of size, again of firm I, industry J, country K times T, and then we regress that against the growth of Chinese imports, measure of lagged technology, as in the ways I've described, the same kind of things about the country time dummy to soak up the macro effects, and then the key thing is interaction between the kind of lagged technology measure and the growth of Chinese imports. So I'm allowing we expect this to have to be a negative effect of Chinese imports on jobs. But if you're a firm which is relatively high tech, we expect that effect to be less negative. So we expect a kind of positive lambda coefficient suggesting this kind of shielding effect from China for the high tech firms. This is picking up, if that was the case, then it's picking up the kind of between firm reallocation type of effect. And the nice thing is you can see this in the raw data. So you don't, without having to do any kind of econometrics, if you just do this almost non-parametrically. So what I do here is I look at the industries where you had the slowest growth of Chinese imports, and then I line up the firms between the high-tech firms and the low-tech firms. So you can see that for most of the firms, there's falls of employment, but for the kind of high-tech firms, there's actually somewhat of an increase of employment, even in those industries where China was growing. If I compare that to, this is the low growth of China industries, this is the high growth of China industries, so this would be like pharmaceuticals, this would be like toys and games or furniture, then you can see that the employment growth here is extremely negative. So firms which are in the lowest quintile of the technology distribution, employment fell by something like 18%. So if you compare that to the low-tech firms in the industries which were less affected by China, there's this kind of huge difference, whereas the high-tech firms are rather unaffected.
I mean, this would be perfectly consistent with the offshoring story, where only the large firms have the ability to offshore some of their production to China, while the smaller firms don't have. And this leads the larger firms to expand and do more on R&D. And so forth.
Yeah, I think the employment and the IT stuff here is kind of consistent with exactly that. I mean, it's, the reallocation could be reallocation across firms within the domestic country itself, or it could actually be moving the jobs off to overseas. So I think that's I'm completely comfortable with that type of interpretation of this type of result.
Yeah, but in that case, I wouldn't call it like an import threat, etc., because it's rather like an offshoring opportunity for some firms and not for others.
Oh, I see what you're saying. I guess, again, it goes back to whether you think the fact this is kind of imports in the output market is sufficient, or you think imports are just, even at the 4-digit level, not reflecting all the kind of different outsourcing opportunities. Okay, I mean, I think that's certainly possible. Again, I guess it goes back to, if you look at the profitability of these companies is actually hurting them. So the profits actually are falling, not rising as it would be if they were benefiting from this offshoring possibility. Okay, so what does this look like? So you see, as I showed you there, as you'd expect, as Chinese imports grow, firms on average tend to shrink. But if you include the interaction, you get this kind of positive and significant interaction. So this is kind of just showing you what you saw in the previous graph, but putting standard errors around them and adding a few additional controls. So you see that whether you measure technology by patent intensity, or whether you measure it by IT intensity, as I showed you in the graph, or whether you measure it by TFP, then the firms which are relatively high-tech are the firms which are less negatively impacted in their jobs. So this is very much saying, consistent with many other papers, that when you're faced by more Chinese imports in your output market, then you tend to shrink in terms of your jobs. So this is having a kind of labour market effect. So this is the political problem here, because the people who are negatively affected, or the firms who are negatively affected, are the ones who are clearly going to resist the import change. Okay, so this gets to Ufit's question. So we can all, both of those, the employment changes and also the technology changes, are both conditional on firms who are surviving. But we think that one of the important parts of what's happening here is that many firms are not surviving. So we run a survival equation. So we take a cohort of firms alive in 2000 and follow them through for the next 5 years. And we do exactly the same kind of regression. So is it the case that for those firms, when they're facing by bigger amounts of Chinese imports in their output market, are they less likely to survive? We expect that the high-tech firms are probably, if anything, more likely to survive. But the interesting thing, again, is the interaction between the Chinese import shock and the technology measure. So you see broadly what you saw for employment. So Chinese imports are negatively associated with your survival chances. But if you're a relatively high-tech firm, you're less likely to exit, whether you measure that by patents or by IT or by TFP. So China is working, both on the intensive margin and on the extensive margin in terms of job changes. So we do a back of so we've got now we've got 3 different elements. So we do a back of the envelope kind of simulation where we say, well, China is affecting these firms in 3 different ways. So if you think about the technology effect, so China is positively influencing within firm technology upgrading, but it's also reducing the number of low-tech firms, so their employment is going down, and they're also disappearing from the marketplace. So if you put all those 3 effects together, what's the kind of magnitude of those 3 different effects? So we take the actual change in, say, patents over the 7-year period, and then we say, well, what fraction of that is overall explained by these different effects, the within-firm effect, the between-firm incumbent effect, and the exit effect. So it's about 14% of the patent upgrading is accounted for by China, and that breaks down to be about 5% within, 6% between, and 2% due to entry and exit. And if you do the same thing for IT intensity, it's kind of the same kind of order of magnitude, although the kind of within and between elements differ. So there's always an important within elements, but there's also an important kind of between elements and a kind of smaller exit part of this as well. So all of those dimensions are at play in terms of understanding the aggregate degree of technological upgrading. I mean, one criticism that you could easily make of this is to say, well, there's one bit of this decomposition we haven't got, which is the entry margin. And the reason that we haven't got that there is, of course, for the entrants, we don't know what their lag technology is before they entered. But what we can do is we can actually just aggregate to the industry level. So we can just look at the industry level, which includes entrants as well as exporters, and run the same kind of regressions. So we do exactly that. So we compare the kind of firm level results down here to the industry level results up here. So the firm level results just have these incumbent within firm changes, whereas the industry stuff includes entry, exit, and also incumbent reallocation effects. And again, you can see that the industry effects are approximately kind of twice the firm effects for patents, which is similar to what the full simulated decomposition was. So that's the kind of main set of results. So let me take you through some kind of extensions to it. So I'm not going to be able to possibly do all of this, but let me just do that. I mean, one of the first concerns that we had is that we model selection directly in this paper. So we're actually, selection is not a kind of econometric problem here. It's part of the economics of looking at how firms are selected depending on the kind of China shock that they face. But there is a type of selection which could be pernicious to us. So for example, if there's a kind of dynamic selection where firms which were knew that they were going to be faced by this China shock were also the same firms who were going to reduce the innovative activity anyway, then we might be picking up just a kind of selection effect because the guys who are exiting are the guys who are going to reduce their innovation, and therefore we're biasing up the estimates that we're making. Now, at the industry level, that's not a problem because at the industry level we capture the whole thing. So, but at the firm level, we might be saying, we might be exaggerating how much of this is within because the within estimates are conditional on survival. So it's, unless you have an instrument for that dynamic selection, it's very difficult to do something about it. But what we do is we follow this kind of Mansky and Pepper idea, which is that we can kind of bound the bias. So we say, well, what's the worst possible case? Well, the worst possible case is the guys who exit would have done 0 patents. You can't do less than 0 patents. That's the lower bound. So let's impute zeros to all the guys who exited and see if that changes any of the results. So this is also a technique that Blundell and Ikamura and Gosling did in the econometric paper. So if you do this, you get this worst case lower bound. And so you can see the worst case, it does, as you expect, reduce the estimates from 0.32 to 0.27, but it doesn't reduce them very much. It's still a positive and significant effect. So we think that even in this worst case scenario, there's still a 2.7% effect from a 10 percentage point in Chinese imports from even in this kind of worst case scenario, which is we were quite pleased at. Okay, so let me talk about the other. So given those results, we also try to build this alternative model which actually tries to take equilibrium effects into account. Because remember, what we're doing here is we're identifying differential effects that firms are facing across different industries. And we have time dummies in here, which is absorbing the kind of macroeconomic effects. So, what would happen if we actually tried to build a kind of GE model with these type of effects in? So in the paper with Paul Romer and Stephen Terry, what we do is we, as I mentioned at the beginning, we take a model where we have a standard type of endogenous growth set up where firms can invest in R&D or in production. We have a trade, so we have two blocks. We have the north and the south. And then we consider what happens when we have these kind of trap factors, which are factors of production, which have some kind of sunk cost or firm specificity. Then with that model, we then say, okay, let's see what happens when we consider things like the China shock, which we model as a reduction in the kind of trade barriers that Europe placed against China. And we say, there was an unexpected shock, which actually reduced the speed at which those trade barriers were taken down. Now, what happens when you do that is that you get the standard endogenous growth effect. So because of the fact that you've reduced trade barriers, firms can export to a larger market. And when they can export to a larger market, that means the market size is increased. So you get this market size effect, which has a positive effect on innovation. That's the standard type of kind of endogenous growth type of effect. But in addition to that, because of this trap factors effect, you get another effect, which is the fact that firms which formerly were producing these old product lines, which are no longer profitable, temporarily reallocate some of the activity to producing new products and creating new innovations. And we show that, in calibrating this to the kind of period between 96 and 2007, this second effect, this trap factor effect, is not non-trivial. So the long-run global growth effect is something like 0.2% from the kind of the usual effect. But in addition, over the kind of the transition period of about 10 years, we get an additional 0.2% effect from trap factors. So that's that's suggesting it's not a it kind of wears out, so it's only a temporary effect. But it's 0.2% over 10 years, which is equivalent, which is similar in size to the larger, longer run type of effect. And if you do a kind of consumption equivalent of that, it's about, of both of these together, it's about 16%, which is an important effect. So in fact, in that, I'm not saying this is true of every single GE model you could write down, but at least in this type of GE model, it tends to magnify the effects we find in the microdata rather than to reduce them. Now, you might say, well, that's all very well, you've written down a model which can show that, but is there any more direct evidence that these trap factors really are what's going on? There could be many other things which are going on. So we do two, this is two bits of evidence to try and look at whether there's something in this trap factor idea by looking at the heterogeneity of the effect of Chinese imports. So one thing that we do is we make a calculation of industry wage premium. So if you think that these are firm-specific skills, then what you should expect to see is that conditional on kind of Mintzerian characteristics, some industries are paying more than you'd expect given the observable characteristics of workers. So we estimate firm-level kind of Mintzerian wage equations, get the industry wage premium, and see whether or not the China effect is bigger in those sectors where those proxies for firm-specific wages are larger. And the second thing we do is we use measured firm-level TFP. So measured firm-level TFP in the presence of trap factors is actually going to be positively correlated to the trap factors. The firm-specific effects are like an intangible capital, which will mean that they load onto the kind of traditional measures of TFP. So we allow the China effect to be different depending on firms and industries which have higher values of these two parts. So what we find is that the effect of China on patenting activity is actually significantly larger where we have these industry wage premia, and also significantly larger for the kind of higher TFP firms. So both of those are kind of consistent. I'm not saying this is there's positive evidence, but it's consistent with the idea that at least these measures of trap factors have something going for thinking about this type of model. So this is still work in progress that we're doing, but I think this kind of trap factor model might have something going for it. Okay, so this is, I think, what you asked earlier about China versus other countries. So this breaks it down into non-China low-wage imports versus China low-wage imports. And basically, it looks kind of similar. So the change in all low-wage imports from all low-wage countries and the change of imports from China have a pretty similar effect, which is kind of suggesting that, in some sense, there's nothing special about China. It's in fact that China is just the canonical example in a lifetime of a kind of low-wage country shock on the markets of richer countries. And by comparison, the evidence for high-wage countries is positive but no significant correlation with innovation. Now this is kind of weaker evidence because we don't have such a good instrument for this as we do for China, but it's at least consistent with the idea that it's imports from low-wage countries which seems to be having this effect on creating more innovation than imports from high-wage countries. Another problem that we were worried about is what we call the lawyer effect. So, we've used patents, but of course, maybe what happens is that when you get hit by a kind of shock by China, you don't do any more real innovation. All you do is you employ more expensive patent lawyers to take patents out on the innovations that you already had. So, is it a real effect or is it just firms patenting more to protect their IP? So we do a few things to check that. So the fact we look at research and development, I think, is really important because, you know, research and development doesn't include payments to patent lawyers. So it's a direct measure. And I showed you there at the beginning, we do find positive effects on R&D. The other thing that we do is we look at citations. So if you thought what was happening is that firms were just patenting, that we're just taking out more and more patents on the kind of marginal pieces of knowledge which weren't patented before, we should expect the citations per patent to fall. In fact, you know, future citations to patents, if anything, rise. I mean, it's not a significant effect, but it's actually positive. And finally, you know, if it's a legal response, we should expect this to happen either immediately or in advance, as kind of Andy was saying. Whereas if it's really an innovation response, it's more likely to be lagged. So when we actually look at some of the dynamics of this, we do find the effect of innovation is lagged 2 or 3 years, where the effect of employment is almost immediate. So all those things make us think it's actually not a kind of a lawyer effect. It's actually something to do with what's happening in the firms. So this is kind of, I mean, we kind of debated this already. Is it all offshoring? So we do, as I mentioned, the kind of offshoring index using the kind of Finster-Hansen technique, where we weight Chinese imports over apparent consumption by using the input-output matrices. So this is kind of proxying how much Chinese imports are increasing for each industry, averaged across the sourcing industries. It obviously still using the 4 digits, so we're not doing it within industries, but this is a measure across industries. And we do, this is what I mentioned before, so we don't find from this offshoring thing any kind of effect on patents, but we do find it's important for IT and TFP. So it's consistent with the idea what's happening is that firms are offshoring some of the lower value parts of their production lines, and this causes your IT intensity to increase and also causes your TFP intensity to increase. But we still find our, you know, the main effect on your output market too. So, you know, there is definitely evidence for offshoring, and it would magnify the effects I've said, but it's, you know, it's our main effects are kind of still there. So this is, you know, the issue about, well, you know, is actually helping you from offshoring? So if you regress the change of Chinese imports, we know it's negative on employment, it's also negative on prices, it's also negative on profits as well. So that kind of tackles that kind of issue that you were discussing. We look at exporting. The exporting effects are not so large. You know, we find basically that it's driven by the import shock rather by the export. So again, this is subject to the criticism that we don't have a great instrument for exports like we do for imports. So I think amazingly, for the first time in my life, I'm ahead of time. So in conclusion, we find that the trade-induced increase, trade with China induces more innovation, both as measured by patents or R&D, but also information technology and TFP. Importantly, this occurs both within and between firms. So I think the between firm stuff, I mean, it's kind of good to show because it's kind of what you'd expect from most heterogeneous trade models. It's good to show in a new context. But the within firm thing, I think, is more surprising. And I think it does call for, you know, more thinking theoretically about why that might be. The models that we discussed this morning in terms of diffusion, I don't think are not going to adequately explain this, because this is about patenting, which is not just about diffusion. So it's about genuinely creating new ideas. A bit like Ezra said, you know, if you just have a pure diffusion model, it doesn't seem to explain really the magnitude of the positive effects that we see from trade. So I do think you need to think about models where we have this induced effect of innovation, genuinely creating new ideas and new products which haven't been out there before. And this is very much consistent with that idea. So, you know, it's not trivial. This is our back of the envelope things. It's maybe 15% in the 2000s and rising. And that it's, you know, the effect is more like low-wage countries and high-wage countries. And, you know, we have a start of a model which tries to understand this with this kind of firm trap factors. And we think this is maybe a useful way to thinking about how firms might innovate to escape competition. Well, thank you very much.
If I fast forward a decade to today, I see Chinese firms not exporting more tires, but talking about buying Pirelli. So they substitute an FDI strategy, which makes sense as wages have changed over time. Will that change the way firms react to that competition?
Yeah, well, it's very much like, you know, we were talking about earlier on. So as China kind of moves further and further up the quality ladder and, you know, is exporting higher tech products, then at least the mechanism that we're describing may be less important because they become more like higher wage countries than lower wage countries. So there'll be a lot of other things which are important. I mean, on the export side, that's still going to be very important in terms of things. But on this import side, it may actually be less important because these will, there'll be perhaps less of this moving up the quality ladder. But having said that, it's still the case that Chinese wages are significantly lower than American or European wages still.
And so if you innovate, might you survive because you become a target for a Chinese takeover?
Maybe. Could be, yeah.